What is up, everybody? I'm hoping you're all well and welcome back to Film Friday, a series in which I use my handy little My Movies app, give it a little shake, and whatever movie it randomly selects for me from my collection will be the movie that I watch and review for you guys, provided I haven't already watched it and reviewed it. So let's not waste any more time, let's not dilly-dally, as some people say. I don't know why I just said it. Let's give this a little shake and see what it gets for me. Oh, okay, well, this will be interesting. Hannibal. So Hannibal is the sequel to The Silence of the Lambs, which is the movie that my app randomly selected for me to review last week for you guys, so the fact that it selected this one next is very weirdly coincidental. Hannibal sees Julianne Moore step into the role of Clarice Starling, which was originally played by Jodie Foster, who now a special agent of the FBI is doing all of her own things, but she still has that lingering fear that Hannibal is still out there in the world, and that he could resurface at any time and go back to his old cannibalistic ways. However, when some new evidence comes forward from a former patient of Hannibal, that being Mason Verger, that could lead to his possible location, Clarice jumps back onto the case in order to find him. However, Mason's true intent into finding Hannibal is soon revealed, which leads Clarice to possibly having to save Hannibal again whilst also bringing him in. And unlike the last movie, as you can probably tell from the description, there's a lot going on in this movie, unlike the first film. The first film was basically Clarice going to Hannibal in order to hopefully get some information as to find Buffalo Bill. But in this movie, you have Clarice Starling hunting for Hannibal, Mason Verger also trying to find Hannibal to get revenge for him being disfigured. You've got a subplot with Ray Liotta, which I will get into in just a few moments, as well as a subplot involving a Roman police officer who is hanging around with Hannibal at this time. And so it's safe to say that there's a lot going on in this movie, and I have to say that that could be this movie's downfall. But before I get into the negatives of this film, I will of course talk about the positives. I do like talking positive about films, and this movie as a whole I don't think is as bad as a lot of people say it is, but it's certainly not up there with how classic and iconic The Silence of the Lambs is. And having to follow that movie up in itself is already going to be a very difficult task. Ridley Scott is taking up directorial duties for this film, and I can't ever discredit the guy as a director. He is incredibly good at what he does. He's great behind the camera, and this movie does show that as well. While there are some weird editing choices, which I may not feel were on his part, I feel were on the editor's part, but were quite quick cutting and I feel were supposed to add to the tension. I don't think that necessarily worked. But in terms of the way that a lot of the film is shot, it's very competently helmed by Ridley Scott. Again, he's a very talented director, so you do see that talent show off on this film. Then you've got the cast, in which you see Anthony Hopkins return as Hannibal Lecter. I mean, the guy is very charismatic, he's very haunting. Again, it does give a very spine-chilling performance in this movie, but not as much as the first film. I feel like in this movie his character was heightened a lot more than it needed to be, and he didn't have that sort of menacing presence whenever he was on screen. Unlike in Silence of the Lambs, when I was constantly on edge whenever he appeared on screen, I didn't feel the same for this movie. I don't know whether that's down to Anthony Hopkins' performance in this movie, or the direction, or the script itself, but it just didn't come off as menacing or as haunting as I'd expect it to be. You've got Julianne Moore, who is replacing Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling in this film, and while she is a fantastic actress and does do a good job portraying this character, I just didn't feel like she had the same dynamic that Jodie Foster had with Anthony Hopkins in the first film. I understand that it's probably a bit unfair that I'm comparing this movie to the first movie, but because it is a direct sequel to that film, I feel like I also have to in those sort of ways. And the biggest praise that I can give Julianne Moore's portrayal of Clarice Starling when compared to Jodie Foster's is Jodie Foster was quite a naive, up-and-coming detective, whereas Clarice Starling in this movie is much more experienced. And while I don't deny that Jodie Foster would definitely have been able to bring that to this role, I feel like Julianne Moore was a fine choice after that. She definitely did a good job of making the character her own while also staying true to what Jodie Foster had set up in the previous film. But honestly, I have to say that the chemistry between her and Anthony Hopkins in this movie wasn't as present. It didn't feel as strong as it did in the previous movie. The rest of the cast all do fine jobs. I don't necessarily think there's a bad performance in the movie. They're all fine in what they do. I mean, it's certainly not some actors' best performances in films, but it's not awful. I think the main thing that really destroys this film is a lot of the subplots in this movie just don't need to happen. This movie is over 2 hours long. I think it's near 2:20, and there's a lot of scenes that really just drag on. Like, for example, the subplot with Ray Liotta, I just didn't feel was necessary at all. I didn't feel like his character really added anything to the film. I feel like if you just took his character out of the film entirely, it would have made no difference to the overall story. I feel like characters still would have gone where they needed to go, and the end result of the film still would have been the same without him being in the film at all. You also have the subplot surrounding the detective in Rome that comes across Hannibal and starts to realise who he is, but he goes about it in a way that I didn't necessarily feel worked all that well. Personally, I feel like if it had just been a manhunt on Clarice's side to hunt down Hannibal, it would have been a much more intriguing film. Obviously, the manhunt for Buffalo Bill in the first movie was one of the main things that pulled you in. It was very gripping, it was very intense. It also had stakes because Buffalo Bill had just kidnapped another girl, and if the police didn't find him in time, this girl would have also ended up dead like his previous victims. However, in this movie, I didn't feel like there were any real stakes if they did find Hannibal. Like, if Clarice didn't start looking for him, or this evidence hadn't been found, Hannibal would have just stayed wherever he was doing whatever he was doing. And yeah, sure, that probably would have involved killing people and eating people, but it wouldn't have affected Clarice's story. The fact that Clarice is still clearly obsessed with trying to find Hannibal should have been the main focal point of this film, and while it is definitely one of the stronger aspects of the story of this movie, I feel like they focus too much on all these other subplots and Mason Verger trying to find him to get revenge for being disfigured by Hannibal. So in that, all these other little subplots that have been forced into the main narrative really do start to fall apart, and you get a very messy film. I do want to give massive props to the makeup department in this film though. Obviously the design for Mason Verger, who is played by Gary Oldman, but you would not be able to tell under all the makeup that he is under, because the makeup department just did a very good job of creating this very horrifying disfigured face. And Gary Oldman's performance as Mason Verger wasn't terrible at all. I thought he did a really good job in this film. But like I said, there is a lot in this movie that really doesn't make sense. There's a lot of subplots that don't need to be there, that could have been cut out. With the movie being near 2 hours 20 minutes long, you didn't need it to be that long at all. There's a lot of stuff that could have been cut out of this film, and you really could have just focused the story in Clarice hunting down Hannibal, because I think that would have been a much more intriguing storyline to follow, rather than having all these other subplots thrown in. And in that, unlike The Silence of the Lambs, which kept you gripped from minute one, this movie really does let up on that sometimes. There are times when I do find myself getting a little bit bored because I want to get back to the whole Clarice Hannibal aspect. Their entire dynamic should really be the main focal point of this movie, but again, the subplots just take away from that. This movie also doubles down on the gore, unlike Silence of the Lambs, which was quite contained with its gore and horror, especially in a dinner scene which involved Clarice, Hannibal and Ray Liotta's character, which if you've seen the film you know what I'm talking about. But the reason The Silence of the Lambs was so good is because it didn't have to show all this gore. All it had to do was imply the horrors that were going on behind it, whereas Hannibal just went the opposite route and decided to show every bit of gore that they could, maybe to be more shocking and more horrifying, but in doing so I feel like it really detracted from that instead. Overall, I don't think Hannibal is an overall terrible movie. It's well held by Ridley Scott. Anthony Hopkins is fantastic as Hannibal, and while their chemistry isn't there, Julianne Moore as Clarice is still really good in this film. But honestly, if they had just tightened the script a little bit more and have the main focus point be Clarice hunting Hannibal and then obviously the big climax at the end, I feel like it would have been a much more enjoyable movie, a much more intriguing movie. I would have been much more invested in this manhunt as Clarice tries to find Hannibal rather than all these other subplots being thrown in. But like I said, it's not a bad movie. It is certainly enjoyable. Like, I didn't find myself getting bored throughout the entire runtime of the movie. There were just a few moments here and there where I could possibly look at the time to see how long was left. But if you are a fan of the Hannibal franchise and you like this character, I do recommend checking it out. Again, Anthony Hopkins is great in this movie. The cast, like I said, aren't bad. The direction's good. The score by Hans Zimmer is also really well done. I do think it matches the tone of this film. And so for all those reasons, I'm going to give Hannibal 3 stars. So, Hannibal, have you guys seen it all? What were your thoughts about it? Whatever your thoughts are, let me know in the comment section below. Thanks to those watching, guys. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and if you want some more videos just like this one, then subscribe to my channel for more. Thanks again for watching. You guys are awesome, and I will see you all in the next video.